Hello friends, and welcome back to this course titled as Introduction to Indian Writing in English. Friends, we were discussing in the last class a very important essay written by Professor Meenakshi Mukherjee from Jawaharlal Nehru University. The title of the essay was The Anxiety of Indianness, Our Novels in English. Friends, we are in the end of Unit 13, and after this class, you would be able to understand the complete author's intention behind writing this essay, and you would be able to critically analyze this essay also as a seminal text on the basis of the discussion which we are going to do in today's class. So without wasting any time, let us begin discussion on critical analysis of this prose work, this essay, The Anxiety of Indianness. Friends, in the last class, we discussed that Meenakshi Mukherjee is emphasizing on the bhashas of English language of India. She says that when any writer is writing in his or her mother tongue, then the expression, the creativity reaches to a satisfactory extent by that writer. That kind of satisfaction in creativity cannot be achieved if you are writing in a foreign language like English language or any other language. She also says that the writers who are true representative of Indian culture, the writers like Temsula Ao, or let's say Northeastern or South Indian, or let's say North Indian writers, they do not get much space into the publication houses which are, let's say, international, because there are writers who had created a pseudo image of India, and those writers have got a lot of space into the works, into, let's say, the books of these international publishers. So this is also, let's say, a pity in the context of India, that the writers who actually know about India are not, let's say, internationally acclaimed and do not get much space to publish their works through international writers, international publishers. Continuing on, let's say, these concepts, she further says that Indian writers working in non-Western literary traditions have never been consumed by nor concerned with the spectre of the Western reader, which has meant that some of the most beloved writers in India are rarely read in the West. So, Meenakshi Mukherjee has a very important concern, friend. She says that the writers who are the beloved writers of India, the writers who had got a lot of space into Sahitya Akademi of India, but they are, let's say, not read by the Western readers, because Western readers do not know much about them, as their works are not, let's say, published through the Western publishers or international publishers. As a widely discussed subject matter, not many would look into the Indianness of a Marathi or Bengali novel. So friends, this is also correct, that if we widely discuss the subject matter, this issue of regionalism and internationalism, we may also find that international readers or readers from, let's say, Europe or readers from America, they do not like to read much about the Indianness which is visible in the work of any Marathi writer or Bengali writer. However, when it comes to Indian fiction in English, the idea of Indianness creeps in, either to assert one's personal identity or as an obsession that resides inherent in both reader and writer. So, Meenakshi Mukherjee says that when we specifically talk about Indian fiction in English, the fiction writers who are writing in English language, that concept of Indianness, that very spirit of India, it creeps in either, let's say, in one's personality, one's personal identity, or as an obsession that resides inherently in both reader and writer. So, this, let's say, Indian fiction in English language is specifically read by the readers who are obsessed of Indianness, or the writers who are obsessed with Indianness. Otherwise, this, let's say, kind of writing do not get much space in the international scenario. The writers are not able to earn much money by publishing their works through international publishers. This has been said to originate because of the language itself, English, which so happens to be no ordinary language, but the language of India's traumatic colonial past. So, Meenakshi Mukherjee says that what is the reason behind it? She says that when any writer writes in English language, it do not, let's say, becomes ordinary. It do not becomes common. The commonness from that language lags behind somewhere, because English is the language of India's traumatic colonial past. Indians were exploited by the Britishers. There is a complete history of colonial exploitation. And that traumatic experience of colonialism, it relies somewhere in the subconscious mind of the Indian writers. So when they write fiction in English language, that kind of, let's say, Indianness, it misses from their work. Additionally, it also carries with it all the significance and privilege that the world link with the language. So this is also a point. She says that this kind of, let's say, Europeanness or Englishness, it is also to a significance and privilege that the world links with the language. So when the writer thinks that he or she must write in English language because the world will associate with it, then that Indianness, let's say, somewhere misses from that language. It may not be further from the north to suggest that English is and will continue to be a necessary evil. So with this, we can conclude that, let's say, this is a truth that English is a kind of necessary evil, and we cannot avoid English from the, let's say, publication and writing and from the Western mentality. Acknowledging this truth would clear a path to understanding the strong emotions associated with underscoring the term Indianness, what Meenakshi Mukherjee calls in her popular essay, The Anxiety of Indianness. So friends, this is how Meenakshi Mukherjee is trying to justify the title, The Anxiety of Indianness. How this anxiety comes into the mind of the Indian writers? Because Indian writers want to write about India, the essence of India, the Indianness into their writings, but that kind of Indianness do not appear in the English language. That kind of, let's say, truth, that kind of strong emotions, that kind of, let's say, the regionalism, that is somewhere absent if any Indian writer writes in Indian language, English language. And which is why the anxiety related to Indianness, it remains in the mind of the Indian writers. The essay aptly sums up an important and intriguing question related to the cultural identity and post-colonial makeover. So, friends, apart from this anxiety, Meenakshi Mukherjee also wished to talk about the cultural identity or the post-colonial makeover. The post-colonial makeover still remains although India got independence in 1947. But how? That is, let's say, discussed to an extent in this essay. It forms a logical and deeply analyzed answer relating to the argument as to should Indian writers come of age and get rid of their colonial hangover to write in their own vernacular languages, or should they continue to write in the Queen's language and thereby forge a new identity in the international platform, or should they form a new kind of English language that would be identifiable with the culture and ethnicity of India. So this is a very valid point. This is reflecting the dilemma in the mind of the Indian writers. There are three options for Indian writers. First is that they should start writing in their mother tongue, maybe Bengali or Hindi or any other language. The second is they should keep writing in English language, but that Indianness will not remain in their works. The third option is that they should develop a different kind of Indian English of writing, which is different from the Queen's language or the European, let's say, British kind of writing. And thus, this new identity, let's say, give a kind of satisfaction to these writers, and this is how they would be able to identify the culture and ethnicity of India. These arguments are essential in the formulation of a national identity of country's own. So, these are the friends, these are the questions which are related to the national identity of India. How, let's say, India should be represented in front of the world. Because the picture of India is, let's say, understood by the international readers only through the, let's say, fictional and non-fictional works which are published here, published by the Indian writers. So, this is complex and very important question for Meenakshi Mukherjee, that how India is represented through these literary works. Divided into 6 sections, the writer begins the essay with a reference to Raja Rao, forward in Kantapura, that was written in 1938 when he was in Paris. So, Meenakshi Mukherjee says, she in the, let's say, in the beginning of this essay, she says that when Raja Rao forwarded towards Kantapura in 1938, when he was in Paris, this kind of attempt made visible first time into Indian writing in English. In the foreword, Rao addresses the problem of the conflict between language and culture in the Indian context for the first time. So, when Raja Rao wrote the foreword of this, let's say, work, he talked about this conflict between language and culture, which is visible into the Indian context. The conflict is due to the difficulty of conveying the myths, legends, and cultural practices of a country in a language that is acquired by us but not inherited. What is the dilemma of Raja Rao, which he is, let's say, writing in his forward portion of this book, Kantapura? This is very valid point. Raja Rao says that every country has its own myths, legends, and cultural practices. India has its own. Now, when we are writing in English language, those kind of, let's say, regional myths, legends, and cultural practices, they are not represented in a well, let's say, structured manner. So, that inherence of, let's say, the concepts, it is not visible when any Indian writer is writing in English language. The English language suits our intellect, but not our emotions. Therefore, writing a regional novel in that language and then finding an international audience for it is a difficult task. This is right, friends. Because international audience will identify that there is some kind of complexity in the novel. They will not understand those myths and regional concepts. They might find it difficult. So the writers who are from India, they have to manipulate the concepts, and in that manipulated concept, regional novels cannot be written. Regional novels means novels which are representing the, let's say, culture of any specific part of India. In the next section of the essay, Meenakshi Mukherjee attempts to show how Indian English literature is different from the regional literature of India. So, in the next section of Meenakshi Mukherjee, she is, let's say, of this essay, Meenakshi Mukherjee is trying to talk about, let's say, how the concepts which are given in Indian English literature, they are different from the actual regional literature of India. When a writer writes in any of the regional languages like Bengali, Hindi, Marathi or others, that writer does not carry the burden of culture, tradition and ethos as a writer of Indian English does. Friends, this is correct. That kind of, let's say, cultural ethos, that kind of traditionalism is, let's say, it is clearly visible when a writer is writing in his or her mother tongue. But that is absent when the writer is writing in Indian English. This is because in the former case, the writer addresses an audience which is not only linguistically but culturally unified. But in the case of an Indian English writer, the larger context comes from play because the country's cultural and linguistic diversity. Friends, this is a very valid point raised by Meenakshi Mukherjee. The problem is that when we talk about the European countries, there is not much variety of religion and languages into one European country or America, let's say. But when we talk about India, there are different languages, different cultures, different, let's say, linguistic diversities, etc. So how can everything be represented in a unified form in English language? For such a writer, it becomes a daunting task to refer to a unified culture, although he or she might hail from one particular region of the country. So friends, this is very valid point. She says that if any writer is writing from Nagaland, now in the, let's say, mother tongue, then writer can represent only the culture of Nagaland and not of Tamil Nadu. But when that novel is published in, let's say, European countries, the European readers would like to read not about the culture of Nagaland specifically, but rather they would like to read about the culture of entire India, which is impossible to be clubbed into one particular novel. Moreover, there is also a nagging question as to why it is at all necessary to write in the language of those people who had been our colonial masters for almost 2 centuries. Friends, this is also a point valid and comes into the mind of Indian writers, that why they should write into English language. This is the language of the exploiter, let's say, the colonial powers who had exploited them. Does it mean that for some people, loyalty to England and her language supersede one's patriotic feelings? Or does it simply imply that these writers are more interested in earning fame and money from an international audience? So, these questions, friends, always come into the mind of Indian writer, that if they are writing in English language, it means they are not patriotic. They do not have those patriotic feelings, or they are only interested in earning fame and money from international audience through writing in English language. All these questions refer to some undefinable cultural values. So, these are the questions which comes into the writer's mind because there are some cultural values remained in the mind of the writer. However, Meenakshi Mukherjee counter-argues that Indian English writers write in English not because of any counter-nationalist feelings, nor because they intend to gain fame or popularity in the international platform. In fact, The audience for regional writers is larger compared to the audience for Indian English writers, but because they have their literary competence in English, irrespective of what their mother tongue might be. This is the problem with the writers, friends, who write in English language. The problem is that they do not have much knowledge of their mother tongue. If they start writing in their mother tongue, they will commit lot of mistakes in their language. Rather, they are more proficient and more competent in writing in English language. And they also know it very well that they will find larger, let's say, audience or larger readers if they write in their regional language, and very less readers if they write in English language, but they had no choice. Choice, why? Because they don't know much about their mother tongue. Rather, they, let's say, are proficient more in English language. Moreover, Mukherjee points out that this trend was not at all a new phenomenon in India, because Mulk Raj Anand, Bhabani Bhattacharya, Kamla Markande and others have also used English as a mode of writing. So friends, we can say that this dilemma existed 100 years back also, when the writers like Mulk Raj Anand, Bhavani Bhattacharya or Kamla Markande, when these writers wrote in English language, the reason could be that they are not proficient enough in their mother tongue, which is why they chose English language to write. By doing so, these writers were able to point out the cultural deficiencies prevalent in India, which have been responsible for its disunity, class and caste inequality in hierarchical Hindu society, religious charlatanism, and unending suffering of the Indian women suffering from the lack of identity in a patriarchal society. Friends, this writing in English language was an attempt of these writers to talk about the disunity of India. The India was divided on the basis of class and caste inequalities, the hierarchy of Hindus over other religions, and the hierarchy of males over females. The regionalism and religion was dominating everywhere, and there was an unending suffering related to the Indian women in the patriarchal society of India. Thus, Indian English writers have for long been trying to unify the country into a linguistic homogeneity so that they can represent a collective identity instead of giving rise to fictionalism. So friends, which is why the writers like Mulk Raj Anand, Bhabani Bhattacharya, etc., they wrote in English language because they wanted to unify India into one culture. They expected linguistic homogeneity. They wanted to unify the India which was divided into pieces of regionalism and religion. So they preferred writing in English language as compared to their regional languages. In section 3 of the essay, Meenakshi Mukherjee delves upon the reason why English writing in English was destined to remain in the nascent stage for a long time, and how ultimately such writers have to depend upon the Indianness of their writings to make a mark in the international arena. So friends, now we are on the third section of the essay, where Meenakshi Mukherjee is again arguing on some important points. The first is that why these writers who were writing into, let's say, English India or pre-independent India, they chose to, let's say, talk about the Indianness into their writings. The reason was because they knew that international arena will give space to their writings only if they talk about Indian context rather than talking about any global or European concept. The main reason for this prolonged infancy or nascent stage are the lack of the proper ground condition of literary production, where the culture and its variations, a language and its dialect, centuries of oral tradition and written literature which go on in making of the new text. Friends, this is the problem with the Indian literary tradition. Most of the Indian literary tradition was in the oral form. So these writers were confused that there was nothing documented earlier and how they are going to express about Indianness into their writings. This is because English in India from the days of colonial rule has remained a language of power and officialdom. Only the minuscule percentage of the country's population use it as a primary language of communication in their personal lives. So friends, the next problem was that in English at the time of Britishers, the language was very powerful and official. Many people were using it who were at the influential posts in India. And the primary aim of communication is in personal lives, not in the literature. Even those who write in English use their vernacular languages to converse with friends, relatives, neighbors, fellow passengers, et.al. in their daily interaction. So, people were using, let's say people were using their mother tongue to interact with their friends and at the personal level, but they were writing in English language. So these people were in the dilemma that whether to get an proficiency in the English language or their mother tongue. The emergence of globalization and the MNC culture has led to continuous use of the language in the workplace for the greater part of the day, but still not replaced the cultured burden of the mother tongue completely. So friends, Meenakshi Mukherjee says that in the present, let's say, era, a let's say, cultural environment is created in India. There is an MNC culture where people interact with each other in the English language rather than their mother tongue. So this has changed completely the way of thinking in Indian mindset, and now people are, let's say, very comfortable in English language as compared to 100 years back time. Consequently, those younger writers who have been fed with European and American literary styles through their course readings, library borrowings, and foreign trips have to rely upon their linkage with the nation's greater cultural issues for recognition. So this is correct, friends. When we talk about the younger writers who got an exposure about European and American literary styles through their, let's say, formal reading, academic degrees, or library borrowings, or foreign trips, they have to rely upon their linkage with the nation's greater cultural issues for recognition. These people were confused that whether they will write about the European culture which they are, let's say, exposed to, or they should write about the Indian nationality and culture to make themselves popular and as an established literary writer. This feature is evident in the writings of all such writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, Anita Desai, V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, and the rest of the brigade. Why? Because these writers, friends, were exposed to the international scenario. So they wanted to, let's say, create that kind of Indianness which has internationalism into their works. Section 4 of the essay commences with Mukherjee's attempt to trace the growth in popularity of the Indian English novel. So now Meenakshi Mukherjee moves to the fourth section of the essay, where she says that Indian English novels are continuously becoming more and more popular in the international arena. It was Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children which showed the profuse liveliness of this genre of literature. So friends, this is right. When Salman Rushdie published Midnight Children, it became an international bestseller. But it was talking about the Indian subcontinent. This novel broke many postmodernist tenets by not only changing the literary map of the world in dealing with the non-Western cultural issues, but also showing that the English language is not only for the English and the Americans to change. So friends, when Salman Rushdie wrote this novel in the postmodernist style of writing, the people in the Europe became aware that Indianness or that Indian context can also be written into the recent style of writing into European and American countries. Rushdie provided a playful and imaginative representation of India's recent history and globalized the scenario. So friends, when Rushdie wrote all these, let's say, works like Midnight Children, he was able to provide a playful and imaginative representation of India. Although it might not be very real to the, let's say, ground level realities of India, but it has a kind of playfulness and imagination about the history and, let's say, globalized world of India. The novel explores the fragile structure of Indian society and the numerous binary oppositions that it represents. This is right, friends. If you read Midnight Children, you will find that it has lot of binary oppositions. Diverse ideas, when they are clubbed together, they reach to, let's say, a goal of a postmodernist novel writing. Thus, Salman Rushdie, for the first time, was able to place an Indian literary piece in the discursive context of the literary canon that had been so long reserved for the elitists of the East-Western world. So friends, we can say that Salman Rushdie was the writer who was able to create an Indian literary piece in discursive context of literary canon. How, let's say, the Indianism should be represented in the, let's say, international language, in the international manner, which was earlier reserved only for the elite Western world, or which was written only by the elite Western writers. But Salman Rushdie was the writer who wrote that kind of Indianness in the elite manner and talking about the Indian culture. Timothy Brennan's 1989 categorization of a new third world cosmopolitans forms the point of discussion in section 5 of the essay Anxiety of Indianness. Now we move to the fifth section of this essay, where this Meenakshi Mukherjee gives the reference of Timothy Brennan's 1989 concept of third world cosmopolitans, because you know that India belonged to the third world. Okay, it is not the first or the second world. These are writers who have emerged from the non-Western culture and have made their mark in the international arena and comprise of major African, Asian and Latin American novelists. So we can say that in this category of third world cosmopolitan, we can include the writers who are, let's say, writing into Western culture from the non-Western background. These are the writers who majorly, let's say, include African, Asian and Latin American novelists who know about their own culture but who are living in the Western world and who know the recent trends of writing style in the Western world. These cosmopolitans, also known as post-colonialists, highlight the experience of colonialism as a theme or metaphor. Friends, when we talk about these writers like Salman Rushdie or other writers, Anita Desai, etc., they knew about cosmopolitan concepts, and which is why they are known as post-colonial writers. They highlighted the experience of colonialism of India in the form of, let's say, different themes, in the form of different metaphors. Such a theme proves useful in tracing the roots of modernity in these non-Western cultures. So we can say that such kind of themes which these writers had taken into their novels. They can help in tracing the roots of modernity in non-Western culture, suggesting that how much developed India is now. Is India competing with the Western culture, or it is still very different from the Western culture? Consequently, it also gives rise to a cultural hybridity, and because of the successful manipulation of Western forms of fabulist narratives and a postmodernist mode of mythicizing local legends with contemporary realities. So, we can also see that such kind of writers, they are creating a hybrid culture about India. They are successfully manipulating the Western forms of narration. And in true sense, these writers can be called as the postmodern writers, talking about the local legends and contemporary realities of the Indian society. Thus, these writings are replete with the idea of rootlessness and displacement. However, there is also the emergence of a new and distinctive difference between non-Western writers, especially those who writes being rooted to their soil and those who have become global citizens. So we can, friends, say on the basis of these examples that these writers had that kind of rootlessness and displacement, which is why they are living in the European countries and writing about India. We can say that in true spirit, these writers are non-Western writers. These writers had roots in their soil and they are now global citizens, but with an Indian, let's say, unique identity. For the latter, the problems of culture and colonization are metaphorical, while for the former, it is real and extant. So we can say that these writers are metaphorically representing the problems of Indian culture and colonization. These writers had that kind of realism into their works. The last section of the essay discusses how the concept of anxiety of Indianness differ from the older generation of Anand, Raja Rao and Narayan with that of the young crop of writers like Upamanyu Chatterjee, Shashi Tharoor, Amitav Ghosh and Vikram Seth. So friends, Meenakshi Mukherjee now moves to the last section of the essay, where she again comes to that question of anxiety of Indianness. And then she says that how that anxiety has changed in its shape in the mind of the writers in the present century. That anxiety existed in the mind of Anand, Rajarao or Narayan also, but now it still exists in the mind of the writers like Upamanyu Chatterjee, Shashi Tharoor, Amitav Ghosh or Vikram Seth. How she answers this question in this last section. While the former attempted to come out of their rooted Indianness and place the country's culture on the globalized platform, having a new identity that was completely different from the colonialist impositions, the latter have tried more and more to be rooted to our Indianness and owing to the pressure of international market. Meenakshi Mukherjee says that if we take the example of Raja Rao or R.K. Narayan, etc., these were the writers who tried to come out of their rooted Indianness. They wanted to decrease the regionalism within their behavior. And they wanted to place the culture of India, the culture of their country, in front of the globalized platform. They were trying to create a new identity of India in front of the world, the colonial powers. But if we talk about the recent writers like Upamanyu Chatterjee, these people are trying to root Indianness into the mind of Indians, because Indians are now moving towards globalized culture. So these writers are concerned that Indians should understand the Indian culture Indians should feel that Indian culture, feel proud to be an Indian. And how, let's say, Indian culture is facing a threat of international market on their, let's say, on their lifestyle. Consequently, it has given rise to a notion that English is the only language in India which is used for literary activities and intellectual discussions, and the other languages seem to have taken a back seat or have totally lost their importance. This is because of the changing social dimensions. So, when we read these recent writers, we can understand that still English is the only language in India which is used for literary activities or intellectual discussions. And the other languages are still subsided. They are still at the back seat. They have lost their importance because of the impact of globalization on Indian society. The social dimensions are changing. And the recent Indian writers are concerned about those changing cosmopolitan effects. The cosmopolitan youth in a globalized atmosphere find it difficult to relate with the Bhasha writers because their own lifestyle either adhere to the privileged upbringing of the Indian English novelists or they aspire to such privilege and elitism. So, we can say that the cosmopolitan youth of India in this kind of globalized atmosphere, they are finding it difficult to relate with Bhasha writers. Bhasha writers means the writers who are writing in Marathi, Gujarati or Rajasthani, because their own lifestyle either adhere to the privileged upbringing of the Indian English novelists or they aspire to such privilege or elitism. The problem is that either most of the Indians, they are now converted into elites, or they aspire that kind of elitism or privilege which the writers in the ancient times had received who wrote into English language. Thus, the changing social dynamics form an integral part in the shaping of our new literary ideas and approaches. So, Meenakshi Mukherjee, let's say, try to say in this last part of the essay that the social dynamics is changing in India and it is shaping the new literary ideas and approaches in the context of India. However, citing Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy as an example, the essayist also argues that there are writers who have an individuality of their own and who can stand out of the crowd to make a mark. So, Meenakshi Mukherjee takes the example of Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy. She says that Vikram Seth has that kind of, let's say, Indianness into his work and he is above that burden of, let's say, anxiety of Indianness in his work. Unlike that of the works of other novelists who are guided by the publishing corporation keeping in mind the profitability of the venture, Seth has ensured that his novels does not become a mere commercial entity. So, Meenakshi Mukherjee appreciates Vikram Seth's style of writing and she says that Vikram Seth do not have that kind of commercial, let's say, expectations fulfilled in his works. He has that kind of Indianness. He do not write to earn money through his novels. Meenakshi Mukherjee concludes the essay by discussing Amitav Ghosh's shadow lines. So, when we talk about, let's say Vikram Seth's works, and now Meenakshi Mukherjee is talking about Amitav Ghosh's the shadow lines into her, let's say, ending of this essay. She observes that this is a novel that does not intend to prove anything or therefore display no anxiety. The issues of marginalization, hybridity and others are all irrelevant in the context of this novel. Meenakshi Mukherjee, when talks about this novel, Shadow Lines, she says that this novel do not have any intention to prove anything in front of readers. This novel do not represent any anxiety. The issues of marginalization, hybridity, and other, they are all irrelevant in the context of this novel, because the writer do not want to prove anything. The writer is not writing to get money out of his novel. The writer is not writing to, let's say, popularize Indian culture, but this is just an expression what the writer feels and what the writer wish to write about some concept. Its categorization into first or third world proves to be an absurd task. So, friends, Meenakshi Mukherjee here says that when she had seen this, when she read this novel, Shadow Lines, she found that neither this novel belonged to the first world nor this novel belonged to the third world. Rather, this is absurd to put this novel into any particular boundary. Why? Because here Amitav Ghosh has represented a total India bereft of any metaphorization. So, Meenakshi Mukherjee says that Amitav Ghosh do not, let's say, do not represent any particular kind of India, any particular part of India, but his work, Shadow Lines, represent the complete India, the total India, the spirit of complete India, and which is why it falls into the category of, let's say, metropolitan kind of novel writing. Friends, this is very important, and a very, let's say, a skilled writer, kind of writer, Indian writer, can reach to that goal. Why? Because, friends, Indian culture is very versatile. Indian culture is very varied. There are regional writers who are writing in their mother tongue, but they represent only one part of India. If any writer from Rajasthan is writing a novel into Rajasthani, then that novel had that Rajasthani spirit only, but not that Indian spirit. There are very few writers who had written in English language and who were able to capture the spirit of entire India, and thus those novels can be called as the national novels of Indian writing in English. Very few writers were able to achieve it. Meenakshi Mukherjee has located, traced, and identified those writers and mentioned them in this essay, The Anxiety of Indianness. Friends, this essay, The Anxiety of Indianness, it was published first in Economic and Political Weekly magazine in volume 28, number 48, and it was published in 1993, starting with the page number 2607, and it ended on 2611. So when you, the copy, the soft copy of this novel, this essay is available online. So when you download this essay and you will read it line by line, you will understand that how deeply Meenakshi Mukherjee is able to comprehend and understand the dilemma of the writers who wrote in English language 100 years back and the writers who are writing in English language in the present century. And in this way, she is able to achieve that kind of excellence, that proficiency, that critical opinion on Indian writing in English. We can say that this attempt, this essay is a true, let's say, representative of that anxiety visible in the mind of Indian writers. Nobody has talked about it before. Which writers belonging to India should be considered as national writers of India? Which writers belonging to India should be considered as regional writers of India? What kind of writing by an Indian writer will give him or her an opportunity to become an international literary personality? What modifications are required in the works of the regional writers so that they get space for their novels in the, let's say, international publishers' books. All these things, all these, let's say, confusions in the mind of the Indian writers are well solved through this work, through this essay, The Anxiety of Indianness. And in this way, we can say that the title justifies itself. This anxiety is always visible, and if any Indian writer will read this essay, would be able to understand the limitations of the work, which the style in which they are writing, and they can overcome from that and can represent the nationality of India through their works. I hope that with this note you have understood this excellently written essay to an extent. That is all for today. Thank you so much.